blood doesn't wash out of a stacked leather handle. It cures it. When Master Sergeant Harrison Graves threw his heavily scarred K-bar onto the mahogany table, it sounded like a gavel striking wood. "People think this is nostalgia," he whispered, sliding a thick, black-barred dossier forward. "No, it's a receipt." The rain outside the Alexandria, Virginia townhouse fell in heavy rhythmic sheets, rattling the window panes of a study that smelled of old paper pipe tobacco and decades of quiet isolation. Wyatt adjusted the gain on his Zoom H6 audio recorder, his eyes darting from the glowing digital levels to the man sitting across from him. Wyatt was a military historian, accustomed to interviewing veterans whose memories had softened into palatable heroic anecdotes. He expected tales of boot camp brotherhood, the sweltering heat of distant deployments, and the standard sanitized version of American military history. He was not prepared for Master Sergeant Harrison Graves. Harrison was 72 years old, but his posture belonged to a man 30 years younger. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held a predatory stillness. He didn't fidget. He didn't look away. He simply stared at the red recording light on Wyatt's device, as if assessing a target. "You told me on the phone that you had something the National Archives missed," Wyatt prompted, gently trying to break the heavy silence in the room. Harrison offered a humorless, dry chuckle that barely moved his chest. He reached into the top drawer of his desk and pulled out a standard-issue United States Marine Corps K-bar combat knife. The leather sheath was practically rotting, bound together with olive-drab paracord. He unsnapped the retaining strap and drew the blade. The steel was dull, non-reflective, and marred by a severe, jagged chip near the hilt. He tossed it onto the table between them. "K-bar is nostalgia," Harrison said, his voice a gravelly baritone. "That's what the brass at the Pentagon told me when I asked to keep it upon my discharge in 2005. They thought I was just a sentimental old supply officer wanting a paperweight." Wyatt frowned, looking at the knife, then back up at the veteran. "Supply officer, your service record stated you were attached to the 4th Marine Logistics Group. My official jacket says a lot of things, Wyatt," Harrison replied, leaning forward into the warm light of the desk lamp. "It says I spent 1984 taking inventory of vehicle parts in Stuttgart. It says I was in a hospital with pneumonia during the winter of 1989. It says I retired peacefully. Every single keystroke of that record is a federally mandated lie." Harrison pushed his chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He knelt beside the desk and pulled a battered airtight pelican case from the shadows. The case was heavily scuffed, secured by 2 heavy-duty brass padlocks. Harrison produced a small key from a chain around his neck and snapped the locks open. The hiss of depressurizing air filled the quiet room. He lifted the lid and began pulling items out, placing them deliberately next to the combat knife. First came a laminated ID badge bearing the insignia of the East German Stasi, complete with Harrison's photo, albeit much younger, under an assumed German alias. Next was a jagged fist-sized piece of burnt titanium, stamped with Cyrillic serial numbers, a fragment of a Soviet Hind helicopter rotor. Then he hauled out a stack of manila folders. They were incredibly thick, the edges yellowed with age. Wyatt felt his pulse quicken. He leaned in, peering at the top folder. The cover was stamped with the seal of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Below the seal, in bold red typewriter-stamped letters, was the word Umbra/No-Fawn. Eyes only. "What is all this?" Wyatt asked, his voice dropping to a whisper, despite them being entirely alone. 38 years of classified proof," Harrison said, tapping the stack of folders with a scarred index finger. "Proof of the Shadow Wars. Proof of the men we abandoned, and proof of the treason committed by the people who pinned medals on our chests. Wyatt hesitated, his hand hovering over the stop button on his recorder. Harrison, if this is what it looks like possessing these documents is a violation of the Espionage Act, you could go to federal prison. I could be implicated just for recording this. I have terminal pancreatic cancer, Wyatt, Harrison said flatly, his expression entirely devoid of self-pity. I have about 4 months left before my organs shut down completely. I'm not afraid of a federal prosecutor, but I am afraid of taking the names in this box to the grave with me. The men I served with in Task Force Anvil, AJSOC element, that officially never existed, they died in the dark. I am going to bring them into the light. Harrison picked up the K-bar. He gripped the heavy steel pommel at the base of the leather handle. With a sudden, practiced twist, the pommel unscrewed. It wasn't a standard knife. It had been custom machined. Harrison tipped the hollowed-out handle over the table, and a small, tightly rolled cylinder of 35mm microfilm dropped onto the wood with a soft click. The documents in that box give you the context, Harrison said, his eyes narrowing. But this film is why a United States Senator tried to have my entire team assassinated in the Bekaa Valley in 1984. Wyatt swallowed hard, staring at the tiny roll of film. Who? Harrison poured himself a small glass of neat bourbon from a crystal decanter on the desk. Let me tell you about Operation Sandstone. Let me tell you how this knife got its chip. The heat in Lebanon during the summer of 1984 was an oppressive, suffocating weight. It smelled of crushed olives, dry earth, and the sharp metallic tang of cordite. Officially, American presence was strictly limited to peacekeeping elements in Beirut. Unofficially deep in the Bekaa Valley, a notorious stronghold for Hezbollah and Syrian intelligence, a 4-man element of Task Force Anvil was moving through the shadows of a ruined stone village. Harrison Graves, then a 30-year-old gunnery sergeant, pressed his back against the crumbling stucco wall of an abandoned bakery. To his left was Corporal Benjamin Cross, a sniper from the mountains of Montana who could put a round through a silver dollar at 800 yards. Covering the rear were Staff Sergeant Mitchell Cole and Sergeant Elias Miller, both specialists in close-quarters combat and signals intelligence. They were dressed in sterile, indigenous clothing. No dog tags, no unit patches. Their weapons suppressed CAR-15 carbines were stripped of any identifying serial numbers. If they were killed, the Pentagon would deny they were ever born. Target building is 50 meters north, Miller whispered into the secure comms unit strapped to his chest. Thermal shows 2 heat signatures inside, 4 more patrolling the perimeter. Copy, Harrison breathed back. Their objective was a man named Tariq. Tariq wasn't a terrorist. He was an international arms broker and a CIA asset who had gone completely off the reservation. The Defense Intelligence Agency had caught wind that Tariq was facilitating the sale of stolen American FIM-92 Stinger missiles. But the buyer wasn't the Soviets. The buyer was a coalition of anti-Western militias, and the money funding the purchase was being laundered through an American shell company. Tariq had a ledger, a physical book detailing every transaction, every bank account, and every Washington insider taking a cut of the illicit arms trade. Task Force Anvil wasn't there to arrest Tariq. They were there to secure the ledger, verify the treason, and scrub the site. Move, Harrison ordered. The team advanced like ghosts. Cross took up an overwatch position on a collapsed roof, his silenced rifle tracking the perimeter guards. Within seconds, 2 muted thwips echoed in the darkness, and 2 guards folded silently into the dust. Harrison Cole and Miller breached the rear door of the target compound, slicing the hinges with breaching wire to make no sound. They swept the dimly lit interior, their weapons raised. The house smelled of stale sweat and cheap tobacco. They found Tariq in the back bedroom. He was already dead. Tariq was slumped over a heavy wooden desk, a single gunshot wound to the back of his head. Blood had pooled on the floor, thick and black in the dim light. "Damn it!" Cole cursed softly, keeping his rifle trained on the windows. "Someone beat us to him. This was a scrub operation." Harrison moved quickly to the body. "Check his wrists." Tariq's left arm was securely chained to a heavy reinforced steel lockbox that was bolted directly to the floorboards. The assassins had killed him, but hadn't had the time or the tools to break the chain or the box before Anvil arrived. "The ledger is in the box," Harrison said. He tugged at the chain. It was thick industrial steel. "Miller, get the thermal torch." "No time," Miller hissed, staring at a portable radar scanner strapped to his wrist. "Boss, we have multiple vehicles converging on our position. We just tripped a silent alarm. At least 30 hostiles closing fast. Cross-talk to me," Harrison barked into his radio. "We are heavily compromised, Gunny." Cross's voice crackled back, unnervingly calm. 3 technicals with heavy machine guns just rolled into the courtyard. They aren't local militia. They're moving like trained operators. Mercenaries. Gunfire erupted outside, shattering the remaining windows of the compound. Heavy caliber rounds tore through the stucco walls as if they were made of paper. The air filled with choking plaster dust. "Hold them off!" Harrison shouted over the deafening roar of automatic fire. Cole and Miller took up positions at the windows, returning controlled, precise bursts of fire, dropping the mercenaries as they tried to rush the doors. Harrison threw his rifle over his shoulder and drew his cowbar. The lockbox wasn't just padlocked. It had a secondary biometric thumb latch that was hopelessly jammed by the blood and the damage from the assassin's initial attempt to open it. Harrison wedged the heavy steel blade of the cowbar directly into the seam of the steel box. He slammed the heel of his boot into the pommel, driving the blade deep into the locking mechanism. The metal groaned. Sparks flew as the high-carbon steel bit into the reinforced lock. Harrison twisted with all his upper body strength. With a loud, violent crack, the locking bar shattered. The extreme torsion snapped a piece of the carbar's blade off, leaving the jagged chip near the hilt, but the box popped open. Inside rested a leather-bound book and a small microcassette tape. Harrison shoved both into his tactical vest, just as a massive explosion rocked the building. An RPG had struck the front wall, throwing Cole violently across the room. A mercenary breached the doorway through the smoke, an AK-47 raised. Before he could squeeze the trigger, Harrison lunged. He didn't have time to ready his rifle. He drove the damaged K-bar upward, under the mercenary's body armor, dropping him instantly. "We are leaving!" Harrison roared, grabbing Cole by the harness and hauling him to his feet. "Cross-drop the technicals, we need a path out the back." They fought their way out of the crumbling safe house, disappearing into the labyrinth of the ruined village under the cover of Cross's sniper fire. They evaded the remaining mercenaries, trekking 15 miles through hostile territory to their designated extraction point, a dry riverbed near the Syrian border. They waited for 3 hours. The extraction chopper never came. Sitting in his study, 38 years later, Harrison took a slow sip of his bourbon. Wyatt sat frozen, the digital recorder blinking steadily between them. "They left you," Wyatt whispered, horrified. "They didn't just leave us," Harrison corrected, his voice laced with absolute, chilling certainty. "I broke radio silence to contact JSOC Command. I got a secure line to the operations overseer back in Washington. I gave him the authenticity code for the ledger. I told him we had the proof of the Stinger missile laundering." Harrison reached out and tapped the small roll of microfilm on the desk. The overseer told me that Task Force Anvil didn't exist and that any unauthorized personnel found in the Bakar Valley would be considered hostile combatants by the United States government. Then he cut the line. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his eyes locking onto Wyatt's. The man who gave the order to burn my team, the man who was taking millions in kickbacks from those stolen missiles, was the very man who later became the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. And I spent the next 3 decades gathering the evidence to prove it. The silence in the Alexandria townhouse was suffocating. Wyatt stared at the digital levels on his audio recorder, watching the green bars pulse with the heavy, uneven sound of Harrison's breathing. The rain continued to batter the glass, a chaotic drumbeat against the stillness of the room. When command cuts the line on you deep in hostile territory, Harrison continued, his voice dropping to a gravelly rasp. You stop being a Marine. You become a ghost, and ghosts don't play by the rules of engagement. The march out of the Bakar Valley took 4 agonizing days. By the second night, the physical toll of their abandonment became violently apparent. Mitchell Cole, who had taken the brunt of the RPG blast in the safe house, collapsed in a dry riverbed. His breathing sounded like wet paper tearing. Harrison recounted his pale eyes, staring straight through the mahogany desk, seeing only the dust of 1984. I rolled him over. His lips were blue. Tracheal deviation, jugular venous distension. The blast had cracked his ribs, and bone fragments had punctured his lung. Tension, pneumothorax. Every time he inhaled, air was leaking into his chest cavity, crushing his heart. He was going into hypovolemic shock. Wyatt winced, practically feeling the grit and the blood. What did you do? Triage in the dirt, Harrison said coldly. We had no medevac, no surgical kit, just a canteens of iodine and the knife. Harrison picked up the K-bar from the desk, his thumb tracing the jagged chip in the steel. I sterilized the blade with iodine. I found the second intercostal space on his chest, mid-clavicular line. I didn't have a scalpel, so I used the point of the K-bar to make the incision. I drove it through the muscle and into the pleural space. The blood sprayed my face, but the hiss of trapped air escaping. It was the loudest sound in the desert. We shoved a hollowed-out radio antenna tube into his chest to keep the lung from collapsing again, and sealed the wound with duct tape and plastic from an MRE wrapper. It was a brutal primitive field surgery, but it kept Cole alive just long enough for the team to cross the Syrian border on foot. They didn't signal the local US embassy. Harrison knew that if the JSOC overseer had burned them, the official intelligence channels were compromised. Instead, Harrison utilized a forged East German Stasi badge, the very one sitting on Wyatt's desk, to contact a black market smuggler in Damascus. They traded their remaining weapons and Tarek's cache of Lebanese pounds to buy passage on a freighter heading to Cyprus. When they finally managed to get Cole into an underground off-the-books clinic in Nicosia, the reality of their situation set in. They were officially dead. The Pentagon had already drafted letters to their families, citing a catastrophic training accident involving a helicopter crash in the Mediterranean. To survive, we had to play dead, Harrison explained, pouring another meager splash of bourbon. I sent Miller and Cross into the wind. I told them to disappear to use the ghost identities we kept for deep cover ops. I personally smuggled Cole back to the States. I managed to get him into Walter Reed National Military Medical Center under the pseudonym John Doe 44, a designation usually reserved for classified intelligence assets. He stayed in the intensive care unit for 3 months, fighting off sepsis while I went to work. You went after the overseer, Wyatt breathed. I went after the system, Harrison corrected. I took Tariq's ledger. It was a gold mine of treason. It detailed offshore routing numbers connected to Riggs Bank in Washington, D.C., a notorious institution that CIA Director William Casey had been using to secretly fund unapproved foreign militias. The ledger proved that American Stinger missiles were being sold to hostile entities, and the profits were being funneled directly into the pockets of Washington elites, bypassing congressional oversight completely. It was the blueprint of a shadow government. But Harrison knew he couldn't just walk into the FBI or the Department of Justice. The corruption ran too deep. He needed a vault. He needed a place where the physical evidence could survive until the people involved were no longer powerful enough to bury it. In the winter of 1985, Harrison said, his voice lowering, "My great-uncle passed away. He was an eccentric, paranoid man who spent his life preparing for a nuclear holocaust. His will stipulated that I was the sole heir to an inheritance nobody in the family wanted, a sprawling 200-acre parcel of land deep in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, specifically an abandoned coal mining claim." Harrison leaned forward, the shadows catching the deep lines of his face. Beneath the rusted husk of the old foreman's cabin was a subterranean reinforced concrete bunker built 50 feet into the bedrock. It had its own diesel generators, air filtration, and heavy steel vault doors. It was completely off the grid, unmapped, unknown to the federal government. That was where Harrison entombed the truth. He took the original Bakar Valley ledger, the blood-stained microcassette tape, and a mountain of supplemental evidence he quietly acquired over the next 2 decades while pretending to be a docile supply officer, and sealed it all in the West Virginia bunker. The microfilm in this K-bar. Harrison said, tapping the tiny cylinder on the desk, is just the index. It's the map. The physical proof, the ink, the signatures, the Riggs Bank transaction, receipts signed by sitting senators, is buried under a mountain of granite. Suddenly Harrison stopped talking. His face turned an ashen, terrifying shade of grey. A wet, violently deep cough racked his chest, echoing loudly in the quiet study. He grabbed a white linen handkerchief from his pocket and pressed it to his mouth. When he pulled it away, Wyatt saw the dark, unmistakable crimson stain of blood. "Harrison!" Wyatt exclaimed, half-standing his chair, scraping loudly. "Do you need a doctor? Let me call an ambulance." "Sit down," Harrison commanded, his voice weak but lined with absolute authority. He was trembling, sweat beading on his forehead as the aggressive pancreatic cancer ravaged his failing organs. "There is a medical kit in the bottom drawer of the desk. Pull it out." Wyatt scrambled around the desk, yanking the drawer open. He found a pristine white medical box. Inside were pre-filled syringes, sterile gloves, and vials of heavy narcotics. The red syringe. Harrison wheezed, tearing open the top buttons of his tailored shirt to reveal a surgically implanted central venous catheter port near his collarbone. "It's a high-dose morphine push. Take the cap off and inject it directly into the port. Do it now." Wyatt's hands shook wildly. He was a man of books and archives, entirely unequipped for life-or-death medical triage. But the terrifying intensity in the old Marine's eyes left no room for hesitation. Wyatt uncapped the syringe, locked it into the plastic valve of the subclavian port, and slowly depressed the plunger. Harrison closed his eyes, his head falling back against the leather chair. His breathing gradually slowed, the violent tremors subsiding as the heavy narcotic flooded his system. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain. When Harrison finally opened his eyes, the predatory gleam had returned, though his physical strength was visibly draining by the second. "You asked me on the phone last week why I chose you, Wyatt. Out of all the military historians, all the journalists in Washington, why you—" Wyatt swallowed hard, placing the empty syringe on the table. You said you read my book on the Beirut barracks bombing. You said I understood the nuance. I lied, Harrison said softly. Wyatt froze. What? Harrison reached out with a trembling hand and pushed the thick Umbra-classified dossier across the table. Open the first page! Wyatt hesitated, then reached out. His fingers brushed the yellowed paper as he flipped the heavy cover open. Pinned to the top of the first page was a black and white photograph of a young Marine in desert fatigues holding a sniper rifle. The man had the same sharp jawline, the same slope of the shoulders, and the exact same piercing eyes that stared back at Wyatt from the mirror every morning. Below the photograph, a typed personnel file read, Corporal Benjamin Cross, Task Force, Anvil, KIA 1984. Wyatt felt the air evacuate his lungs. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. He stared at the name, Cross. Wyatt's mother had changed their last name to her maiden name when he was just an infant. She told him his father died in a helicopter crash in the Mediterranean, a tragic, unavoidable training accident. My father. Wyatt whispered, his voice cracking the weight of a 38-year-old lie crashing down on his shoulders. Benjamin was the finest marksman I ever knew, Harrison said, his voice thick with a sorrow he had clearly carried for decades. When I told him to disappear to use a ghost identity, he refused. He said he had a wife and a baby boy waiting for him in Virginia. He tried to come home. He tried to come back to you. Harrison coughed again, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. The Overseer's men found Benjamin in a motel in Frankfurt before he could secure a flight. They murdered him. And then they handed your mother a folded flag and a pension and told her a lie. Tears blurred Wyatt's vision. The academic detachment he had maintained all evening, shattered entirely, replaced by a visceral, blinding anger. He looked at the Kaaba, he looked at the Stasi badge, and then he looked at the man who had commanded his father. Why wait until now? Wyatt demanded, his voice thick with grief and rage. Why let them get away with it for 38 years? Because they owned the Department of Justice, Wyatt. They owned the courts. If I had stepped forward in 1984, they would have labeled me a rogue lunatic, buried the evidence and killed me in a federal holding cell. Harrison replied, his voice dropping to a whisper. But they are old now. Their political armor has rusted, and I am a dying man with nothing left to lose. Harrison reached under the desk. A heavy mechanical click echoed in the room. What was that? Wyatt asked, wiping his eyes. A dead man's switch. Harrison smiled, though there was no joy in it. For the last 2 hours, a secured server in the basement has been authenticating my voice and my pulse via a biometric monitor on my wrist. I just overrode the delay. The contents of that microfilm, the index, the names, the coordinates to the Appalachian bunker have just been simultaneously encrypted and emailed to 50 major news agencies across the globe. It cannot be stopped. It cannot be recalled. Harrison slumped deeper into his chair, the morphine finally pulling him toward the inevitable dark. He slid a heavy iron key across the mahogany desk. It came to rest right next to the chipped K-bar. The coordinates are on the film, Harrison whispered, his eyes slowly closing. The key opens the vault in West Virginia. Go there, Wyatt. Go get the ledger. Expose the men who sold your father's life for 30 pieces of silver. Wyatt stared at the old Marine, the digital recorder still rolling, capturing the final labored breaths of a man who had fought a shadow war for 4 decades. Wyatt reached out. He didn't take the recorder. He didn't take the dossier. He picked up the key, and he picked up the K-bar. The leather handle felt heavy, anchored by history and cured in blood. I will, Wyatt promised the quiet room. Harrison Graves gave one final slow nod, his chest rising a fraction of an inch before settling into a stillness that would never be broken again. Outside, the rain washed the streets of Alexandria clean, but Wyatt knew the storm was only just beginning. If this thrilling story of betrayal, classified secrets, and ultimate justice kept you on the edge of your seat, hit the like button and share it with others who demand the truth. Please do not forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell for more real-life military stories and uncovered conspiracies. What would you do in Harrison's shoes? Let us know in the comment section down below.